Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Chamberlain. I'm the chair of the board of Georgian Bay Forever, and I'd like to take a minute to welcome you all to our session today. First of all, I'd like to take a second to acknowledge and to honor the land that we live on and that we spend our summers and other times on, and our relationship to our Indigenous cousins and people. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation. We talk a lot about the land in these land acknowledgements, and they're important. It's a very important thing to recognize who was here before us, but it's also really important to understand and to acknowledge the fact that we are in a process, in the midst of a process of reconciliation. In my life, I find that my Indigenous colleagues, friends, and acquaintances are acutely aware of this need for reconciliation, and unfortunately, sometimes non-Indigenous Canadians aren't quite as clear on this. So I just wanted to take this moment to say that we should all think about it. And I'd recommend to you and commend to you a quick read of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation report, which came out a few years ago. First of all, next, I'd like to just acknowledge that the territories that we're speaking of today, that is to say, are the areas around and within the islands of Georgian Bay and the coastlines around it, have been long the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. There's been countless other Indigenous occupants of these lands over the eons, and this is a land, it's a good reminder of the fact that this is land that is not always as it appears now. It looked a lot different for a long time, and it has evolved. And the people that lived on it made their living and found their way and learned to survive in a way that, frankly, we are only beginning to remember. Across Ontario as well, there are many treaties and agreements that govern the relationship between the Crown, the people, the treaty people that we all are. And this extends across what we now are beginning to hear called Turtle Island, that is to say North America. And the Indigenous peoples of this area include the First Nations I've already described, but also the Inuit and the Métis. And the Métis, I might add, has had a thriving community within the area around Georgian Bay for generations and generations. So we are, as I said before, we are all treaty people, and many of us came to this land from somewhere far away. Others were fortunate enough to be born here and have grown up here, but we've all been here for generations. Some long generations, some short. Our Indigenous colleagues, friends, and acquaintances, their families, their peoples have been here much, much longer. And as I said before, we ought to take a time to learn as much as we can, read as much as we can about those peoples and their histories, and to learn to appreciate it. Next, I'd like to just mention that these webinars are jointly sponsored by the Georgian Bay Association, Georgian Bay Forever, and they're in collaboration with our partners from the International Joint Commission, Severn Sound Environmental Association, and the Council of the Great Lakes. They are the work of many people, and I want to just take this time to thank all those involved in the organization and setting up of these webinars. The housekeeping matters I'm not going to go into. They are in the question and answer, the Q&A part of the Zoom function, so you should be able to see them there quite easily. And before we kick off the webinar proper, I'd like to introduce to you Marilyn Capriole, who will conduct today's opening ceremony. Marilyn is an Anishinaabe elder from Shawanaga First Nation and is a founding member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership Elders Lodge. She's long been an advocate of Georgian Bay water issues and a longtime volunteer on many worthwhile causes. She is also involved with the Georgian Bay Biosphere and is a member of the Indigenous Circle of the Canadian Biosphere Reserves Association. Welcome, Marilyn, and thank you for being here with us today. Miigwech.
Oh, miigwech. Mino Josep Minan Kenawea Shamanado Mishomas Nokamasok miigwech. Na Bishquadish na Karza Makwado Dem Shawanaga Dunjaba. I greet everyone this morning and acknowledge the Creator, our grandfather and our grandmothers for giving us such a beautiful sacred day to join his family and circle one more time. When we talk about the spirit of the land, the water, the air, the four-legged, the two-legged, the plant life, the flyers, the crawlers, the swimmers, we are talking about creators' gifts. But most important is that we acknowledge the governance and the workings of those gifts. So today we are at half mark from the new moon, and she's walking towards the next full moon, the full dress of grandmother. And we will call that Oshkanodon Dinin na Jesus. And what that means is that it's the freezing moon. So grandmother is coming so close to the earth now. And she comes this close during these resting moons that will follow her. She watches her children to make sure that each and every one has gone to bed, is comfortable and covered. The few times and in different places, we've already seen that she is beginning to unbraid her hair with those beautiful light blankets of snow. Here in Minnetonka and the Great Lakes, we haven't had those blankets come, but only just to test. The other morning was the most important, that we had a thick layer of frost lay upon her body. And that is important to give those lost plants that shock, begin to freeze, and gently put those sleepers to sleep. And with this, I am going to stop speaking about Earth Woman, her waters, her gifts. And I would like to acknowledge our sacred and beautiful men for allowing us to talk through your territory, giving us ethical space. That is the sky world. In our culture, we believe that women take care of the water. We are the life givers. We carry that beautiful first lodge of all life in every species that there is on this gifted planet. The sky world is where our beautiful men sit, with the responsibilities of keeping the sacred spirit of fire to continue in the forever. And with that, we acknowledge the hard work that you will have over the winter moons, keeping all things in natural order. I'd also like to acknowledge that at this time of year, our four-leggeds begin that birthing channel, that journey, so that in the spring we will admire their newborns along with all other things. So my friends and family, we will join together in a wonderful, beautiful circle of knowledge today. Miigwech.
Yeah, seem to be having difficulty with the video, so I will speak, and hopefully everyone can see me. Good morning, my name is Rolf Jones, and I'm the chair of the Georgian Bay Association. And before I introduce you to Aisha Shonda, I'd like you to remember the following 5 words as a key takeaway from today. These 5 words are simply your voice on the Bay. The Georgian Bay Association is here to advocate for our 18 cottage associations and our approximately 3,000 members and 18,000 family members. We are here to speak to government agencies at every level on your behalf to ensure that your Georgian Bay questions, comments, and concerns are heard and addressed. So to keep the presentation moving along, I'd like to introduce you to Aisha Shonda. And Aisha is a water scientist with the Severn Sound Environmental Association. She's been a scientist there for approximately the last 15 years and Aisha has a passion for all our Great Lakes and protecting aquatic systems. So without further ado, over to you to Aisha.
SSEA is very pleased to be a part of this webinar series, and we see great value in educating both residents and government officials on the need for shoreline resilience. Protecting and enhancing natural shorelines is a key part of the solution to deal with our fluctuating water levels. As a joint municipal service board that represents 8 municipalities in our watershed, the SSEA is committed to working with stakeholders to encourage solutions that really rely on green technologies. So I'm happy to introduce 2 speakers who are going to provide some excellent foundational knowledge for on the stressors that act on our shorelines. So first up will be Majka, who is a restoration ecologist with extensive experience in design and implementation of wetland construction, soft shoreline engineering, natural areas management, and best management practices throughout the Eastern United States. He has a degree in natural resources and environmental science from Purdue University and is a founding member of the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, where he helped implement a program to teach the design and practice of natural shoreline installation. He is currently developing a Great Lakes nature-based shoreline decision tool for New York and Michigan, as well as a nature-based shoreline certification program for Ohio. Brian is responsible for project management of ecological restoration design and implementation projects for GEI. Our second speaker is Alex Ray, who is the owner and lead consultant for Payette Environmental Services, located in McCall, Idaho. He specializes in the intersection between recreation and water resources and holds a master's in environmental management degree from Western Colorado University. He regularly speaks with activist groups about wake boats and their impacts on aquatic systems. And we're excited to hear what both of these gentlemen have to say.
Thank you, Aisha, for that introduction, and I'd like to go ahead and get started. As Aisha mentioned, I'm a restoration ecologist. I am not an engineer, but I'm an ecologist who pretends to be an engineer. I work as part of a broad team of ecologists and engineers that work together throughout the Great Lakes on the restoration of ecological systems. I'm actually based here in Michigan, but we also have a large team based in Ontario in the Toronto area of ecologist engineers that work on very similar types of projects. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is really just introducing the how and why of how waves work. And what that's going to do is lead us into the discussion of what we can do to start to mitigate that kind of wave energy, starting with this base understanding of the physical and natural processes. So talk a little bit about what waves are, where do they come from, what are their characteristics, and then how do they actually impact their shorelines. Next slide. So when we talk about waves, it's really important to really understand what a wave is and how waves originate. So if you think about a rubber ducky or a raft floating in the water, when a wave comes by, that raft or rubber ducky will just go up and down. And that's because a wave is a transfer of energy and not necessarily a transfer of mass. One of the best ways to think about waves is they're really just solar powered energy. We have uneven heating of the earth, which causes wind. That wind, when it passes over an object such as water, it creates friction. And through that process of creating friction, the wind transfers its energy to the water. So waves really are nothing more than solar powered energy. Next slide. So we're going to start with a few quick definitions, which I think are important, and then we'll talk a little bit more about just how waves work. When we talk about waves, one of the common terms that we use is fetch. And the fetch is the longest uninterrupted distance across the open water from a given site. So depending on where you're at, your site orientation within the specific water body really does matter a lot, because as wind crosses a given water body, it builds that wave energy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Bathymetry is the elevation of the bed in a body of water. So really, what does that underwater surface actually look like? That term is bathymetry. And then a term that we use a lot when we're talking about shorelines and natural shorelines is slope. And we often talk about slope in terms of run versus rise. So in this case, if we have 5 feet or 5 meters of run compared to 1 meter of rise, we would say that that is a 5-to-1 slope. And that becomes very important when we start to understand how wave energy actually interacts with our shorelines. Next slide. So where do waves actually come from? There are 3 main places. First and foremost, natural waves. They're actually wind driven. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in just a second. But waves tend to be wind driven, gravitational through tides. We actually do get small tides here in the Great Lakes. For those of you that study the Great Lakes extensively and look at water levels, you actually see that things like the moon do affect water levels to a small degree, not like what we see in our marine surfaces. And then disturbance driven. So disturbance driven waves are essentially caused by a displacement in water. In our marine coasts, that might be a tsunami. Something that we deal with here in our Great Lakes and inland lakes a lot are boats, and we'll talk about that quite a bit. Or any of you that's ever jumped into a pool off of a diving board through a cannonball and have created waves, that's another perfect example of how a disturbance-driven wave is created. Next slide. So first thing we're talking about here are wind-driven waves, and these really are our naturally occurring waves. Anytime 2 molecules pass each other, 2 molecules of anything, they create friction. Well, in this case, going back to this idea that waves are solar-powered energy, we have uneven heating of the Earth's surface, which creates wind. The wind crosses a water body. As that wind crosses the water body, it creates friction. And when that starts to happen, that friction starts to create what we think of as micro ripples. So you see in this picture here with a very light wind, that friction starts to cause these ripples. Well, as the wind blows longer or blows stronger or blows over a longer period of time, once those small ripples start to form, we only get more friction. So the higher those ripples get, the more friction is created, and the larger those ripples start to turn into waves. So what that leads us to understand really is that wave height is a function of fetch, wind speed, direction, and water depth. It's all of these factors together. And any one of those factors, as it grows in size or length or strength, it will lead us into creating larger waves. Next slide. So the other factor that we need to understand about waves is really how they break. So we have the situation where these smaller ripples start to turn into larger ripples, which then turn into waves, which then turn into larger waves. Well, as those waves start to get closer to our shorelines, at some point they will start to break. And those waves will start to break when the wave height reaches approximately 80% of the water depth. So what that really means is that when we have a steeper shoreline, the waves are going to break much more closely to the shoreline. And if we have a gentler shoreline, the waves are going to break offshore. And that becomes very important when we understand how those physical forces really interact with our shoreline, because as the orbital force of that wave breaks onto our shoreline itself, all that energy can either get transferred offshore or it can get transferred directly onto our shoreline. Next slide. So the other type of wave that we typically deal with are boat-driven waves. And boat-driven waves share a number of common principles with our wind-driven waves, but they also act very differently because boat-driven waves are really created by the displacement of water. And the amount of displacement is a factor of that boat hull size and speed. So when you look at this graph that we have here, you see this bit of an up and down, and that's because as a larger boat starts to gain speed, it displaces more water up to a peak. Because what happens, and for those of you that are boaters, you might know this, a boat's essentially, people use the term plowing water when it's running at lower speeds. But as a boat gains speed, it will actually start to plane across the surface of the water. When that happens, friction and displacement are reduced, and you actually see wave heights start to go down to some degree. So boats actually create the largest waves and the most amount of displacement when they are running at kind of those intermediate speeds. So again, those wave heights, so understanding that wave heights are a function of wind speed, duration, and water depth, boats can actually create larger waves than wind-driven waves can, because boats can essentially push water. So while wind-driven waves are limited often by fetch and by water depth, that act of water displacement by boats pushes water and increases water depth, which therefore can increase the size of a wave that builds and interacts toward that shoreline. So while the waves are periodic, and boat waves tend to have shorter duration because they're episodic, they only occur when boats are being created, they can have a more significant short-term impact on our shorelines themselves. Next slide. So all of this is important because when we start to understand the energy and erosive forces on our shoreline, really the most significant factor, whether it comes down to wind-driven waves or boat-driven waves, winds up being wave height. There are other factors that impact our shorelines, but wave height winds up being most significant. So understanding our shorelines really boils down first and foremost to understanding wave height. And all of you are going to have different properties that have different fetch, different depth, different orientation and run up, and different structures that will influence how those shorelines actually absorb or interact with our Great Lakes waves. Next slide. So this graphic of our little surfer person, and for those of you that may not be aware, people do surf the Great Lakes. It's not just reserved for the Marine Coast. This surfer really starts to demonstrate the importance of slope. So as we watch this graphic, what we'll see is 3 different runs of waves with a gentle, a moderate, and a steep slope. Here coming up, we're going to watch our surfer surf a shoreline with a steep slope, and you'll see what happens there is that wave isn't going to break until right when it gets up to our shoreline. And when that happens, all of that energy is transferred right onto the shoreline itself. However, when we have a gentle slope, which is more similar to our historic natural shorelines, the wake will break offshore. And when that happens, the actual wave energy transferred onto the shoreline itself is significantly reduced. And then when we have a moderate shoreline, that's where we get somewhere in between. So understanding that shoreline slope becomes incredibly important. Next slide. So here's a couple of perfect examples of this. I took the picture on the lower right. That's Lake Michigan, not far from where I live. On this particular day, Lake Michigan had 25-foot waves. But because it's a natural beach shoreline, those waves were actually breaking about 100 or somewhere between 20 and 40 meters offshore itself. So when that happened, the actual wave energy that's interacting with the shoreline is significantly reduced. on the picture on the upper right, there was a storm with sustained winds. This is a shoreline. This is an inland lake. And because there was a seawall and there was no ability to mitigate that that wave energy, the waves didn't break until they hit the shoreline itself. And in this case, you had a significant amount of energy breaking right in front of these homes. So that slope really means a lot. Next slide. So how does that wave energy degrade our shorelines? It works to create soil erosion. It physically displaces plants, and it increases turbidity in the shorelines, which then limits the aquatic plant growth, which helps to actually stabilize our shorelines. Next slide. So just kind of wrapping things up and how this leads into an understanding of wave mitigation strategies, which Alex is going to talk about some. If we can go to the next slide here. Understanding how to restore shorelines in the Great Lakes begins with an understanding of what nature has already figured out. So we take our existing physical conditions, we compare them to natural Great Lakes shorelines, and then that starts to give us clues for how we can design natural systems to mitigate wave energy. So our natural Great Lakes shorelines, this is an open-facing wetland in Lake Michigan, very high energy. They tend to have gentle slopes, that 10-to-1 to 20-to-1 ratio. They tend to be dynamic and transient. They constantly move, but they have kind of dynamic stability. They're not always vegetated. They tend to have these mosaics of shrubs and grasses and wildflowers. And by understanding those, they give us a template for understanding how to restore and protect our shorelines. Next slide. So just wrapping things up quickly here. Waves originate from typically disturbances or wind. Wind speed and duration are key factors in understanding wave height, which creates those forces in our shorelines themselves. And gentler shorelines and slopes and vegetation are going to work to dampen and dissipate wave energy, which can then create that basis for us to be able to create soft but stable shorelines. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Alex to talk a little bit more about some specific strategies that we can use to mitigate that wave energy.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian, for that great presentation on waves. Oh. Are we live here?
You're good.
Yes, Alex.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm gonna start over completely again here. First, I want to thank Brian for his presentation on waves. It's always great to hear that. It's a good background and good primer on how this all works. So my name is Alex Ray, and I'm the owner of Payette Environmental Services in McCall, Idaho. I want to talk to you all today about a couple of other important and relevant topics surrounding waves. First, we'll talk about boat-generated wakes and the state of the science surrounding wake boats specifically. Second, we'll talk about the impacts of waves and wakes on shorelines and what we can do to mitigate the negative effects of rising waters. We will be taking questions at the end of this presentation, so hold on to your thoughts. Next slide, please. So the first topic, and the one that's been on a lot of people's minds these days, is wake boats. As many of you know, wake boats have been rapidly gaining in popularity over the last 15 years and have now become nearly ubiquitous on our waterways. Wake surfing has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's because it offers an easy and really fun way for the whole family to get on the water. And you know, it's always great that we have more people recreating in the outdoors, but like all new technologies, it's important we're well-versed on the potential negative impacts of boat wakes, as well as what we can do to mitigate those impacts. So first, we'll talk about the potential impacts from wake boats and the state of the science regarding wake boats. Next slide, please. The first concern surrounding wake boats is the overall size of their wakes, which can lead to a higher potential for shoreline erosion and shoreline infrastructure damage. Over the past decade, a number of researchers have looked at the height of wake boat wakes, including myself, and we have all come up with fairly consistent results. First, while wake boat wakes can regularly be over 3 feet high at the time of propagation, they break down quickly to around a foot high within 100 feet of the sailing line. However, complete attenuation of wake boat wakes occurs over 1,000 feet from the sailing line. This is far more than we see from other motorized watercraft, simply because the wave that's propagated is so much larger at the initial instance. Finally, on fetch-limited bodies of water, the wakes from a wake boat carry far more energy than wind waves. This is important because although Georgian Bay is a massive body of water and can have quite large wind waves, there are a lot of sheltered inlets and coves that are likely classified as fetch-limited. This will have this will make a difference when you're looking at boat traffic versus wind traffic versus just the natural background noise. So there's, like I said, these wakes, this has been well studied. We know a lot about bow wakes and how they operate, but there's also some really interesting new research in this field happening right here on Payette Lake here in McCall, Idaho. A graduate student from the University of Idaho is using a LiDAR scanner to measure erosion and accretion on shorelines around the lake. And she is teasing out the differences between erosion, turbidity, and nutrient loading from wakes versus natural waves. She's still collecting and processing data, but her work will likely be groundbreaking as far as measuring the real world erosive effects on boat wakes on shorelines. Next slide, please. So the second concern surrounding wake boats is their potential to disturb lake bottom sediments due to the force of the slipstream or the jet of water coming from the propeller of the boat. Because wake boats typically operate in displacement mode, where they're plowing water, like Brian said, the slipstream velocity is the highest at this point, and the boats often operate stern heavy, where the slipstream is directed at a pretty high angle towards the lake bed. When this happens, the potential for the slipstream to disturb bottom sediments is much higher than what we see with other motorized watercraft. Unlike wakes, not really much research has been done in this field. In 2015, researchers from Laval University there in Quebec used an underwater acoustic Doppler device to measure slipstream velocities in the water column. I also modeled the effects in my own research, and our study showed that lake bed sediments were likely being affected at depths of 16 to 20 feet and potentially even deeper. Again, not much research has been done in this field, but currently, there is some really good work being done looking at slipstreams happening at the University of Minnesota, where they're using an acoustic Doppler device again to measure slipstream velocities, and they're testing with the newest and kind of more powerful model of wake boats. It'll be really interesting to see the results. I think they anticipate releasing some data later or early next year, but like Heather's study here in McCall, the results will likely be groundbreaking in terms of actually being able to quantify how wake boats and other motorized boats can affect aquatic ecosystems. As I said, it's really important that we know the limits and the bounds of this new technology so we can come up with appropriate management schemes. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of this research on wake boat management? From what we have seen so far, no wake zones for motorized watercraft using wave enhancing technology should be a minimum 500 feet from shore. Wake boats should be operated in sufficiently deep water to protect bottom sediments and nearshore vegetation from disturbance. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Due to substrate types, the size of the body of the water, the shoreline characteristics, infrastructure, other users, and so on, each body of water will present its own specific limitations and opportunities. Next slide, please. So the next topic I want to talk about is mitigation strategies. Now that we know how waves, wakes, and rising water levels can affect aquatic ecosystems and shorelines, we have to talk about how to protect them. And as ecologists have seen over the years, this is best accomplished through the use of living shorelines. In the most basic sense, living shorelines are a simple bioengineering solution that seeks to mimic the energy buffering powers of natural shorelines, like Brian just explained to you. There are really countless examples of this buffering process from nearly every aquatic ecosystem around the world. But one of the most obvious examples is from the mangrove forest found in tropical and subtropical climates. These large expanses of sturdy trees along the coastlines protect the coastline from hurricane strength storm surges. They can buffer the impact of huge waves and huge winds and rising water levels in some cases. Where we see mangroves have been cleared or lost to rising sea levels, we're now seeing much more severe damage and erosion from the storms along the coastlines simply because those large trees aren't there to buffer the energy. That's a really large scale example, but an example of a wave buffering ecosystem around the Great Lakes are the coastal wetlands in East Georgian Bay. Their aquatic and emergent plants, rather than trees, dissipate a much lower amount of potential energy, which protects shoreline marshes and meadows from the erosive effects of waves. You saw some of that in a video there on Brian's presentation. And like he said, this is what living shorelines are most often trying to mimic, is that natural shoreline. In the photo displayed on the slide here, you can see one of the most basic examples of a living shoreline. Coconut husk fibers, or kawir, have been used as a wattle, also called a kawir log, along with bags of oyster shells to buffer wave energy, kind of like a breakwater, before it reaches the lakeshore vegetation. Next slide, please. So traditionally, shorelines have been protected using concrete seawalls or high-angle boulder revetments, typically called riprap. These structures do okay in protecting the land behind them, but what we have seen is that the wave energy is reflected rather than absorbed when it hits them. This leads to scouring of beaches and the lake bed or seabed in front of the wall, and erosion of the shoreline around the ends of the walls. When the bottom of this and the sides of the wall are undercut, the walls then become prone to failure, which leaves behind a huge mess and an unprotected shoreline. Living shorelines, on the other hand, are designed to absorb rather than reflect that wave energy. Mimicking the coastal wetlands, aquatic and emergent plants are used as an initial energy buffer. Soft materials like kawir logs are used as a heavier buffer, and vegetation is replanted to strengthen the shoreline. In this slide, you can see another basic living shoreline design for an area with low wave energy. Next slide, please. So in this slide, you can see an example of a living shoreline design in an area with a little bit higher wave energy. Rocks have been added as an initial energy buffer below the water line, and woody native species like willow, which have a dense, heavy root mat, have been planted to protect the shoreline. Besides buffering the wave energy, living shorelines have quite a few other benefits. Not only are they natural and aesthetically pleasing solution to erosion, they're often low cost. They help reduce pollutants by filtering runoff, and they provide really great nearshore and riparian habitat. Living shoreline designs like those displayed in this picture are great for low angle shorelines. When the shoreline is steeper, other techniques have to be put into play. One of these solutions are a material called Bio-D blocks. And the Bio-D block is like a gabion basket, but it's made out of kawir, and it's not as rigid as a gabion basket, but it's like a giant kawir log almost. And they can be planted with native seedlings and willow stakes to improve slope stability. And another solution is kawir mats, which are anchored with seedlings and live stakes to steeper slopes. This technique with kawir mats you can often see on road cuts. I know it's becoming a popular technique there in the road industry. So where remediation is not possible because of excessive erosion or vertical bluffs, at times it may be necessary to assume a new shoreline, which can then be more sustainably stabilized. Next slide, please. So obviously this is all just the beginning when it comes to living shorelines, and we could talk about design, placement, and a lot of other aspects for the rest of the day. In the interest of time, I want to share some online resources which can get you started if you're interested in learning more about this topic. I really like the information in the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council site. And Brian, who just spoke to you about waves, is also a local resource that is extremely knowledgeable in this field. Reaching out to your local advocacy group like Georgian Bay Forever or the Georgian Bay Association is also highly encouraged to find out more information. They're all really great resources. Next slide, please. So thank you all for attending my presentation. Thank you to the Georgian Bay Foundation and Georgian Bay Association for having me here today. And next we'll hear from the Georgian Bay Foundation Executive Director, David Sweetnam.
Thanks, Alex. And thank you, Brian, for the great information so far. We will have some questions coming up at the end of the session, so stand by. Next slide, please. Some of the difficulty in this whole discussion really boils down to more of the social acceptance side of this equation. And there's really kind of two distinct thoughts that we want to break apart today and kind of come to a better understanding of. One is that flooding, erosion, and dynamic beaches are naturally occurring processes, which by themselves aren't hazards. They only become hazards when human activities and development encroach within those environments. And the other way of looking at flooding, erosion, and dynamic beaches is that they're hazards which have to be kind of beaten into submission through a variety of means. And we want to talk next, if we don't value a system like a coastal wetland, then we tend to, destroy it. And so in order to start to get a better understanding of the importance and value of these areas, not just for property protection and coastal protection, but also for the ecosystem services that they provide, we have our next speaker, who is going to give us some more information, Roy Brooke, on natural coastal assets. If you just flip to the next slide, please. We want to go from not valuing the wetland in the before picture here to really understanding the value of what you see in the after picture here. So Roy, we'll turn it over to you. Roy is going to tell us about natural asset management. He's the executive director of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative and is joining us very early this morning from the West Coast. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to everyone who's listening. Yes, I'm joining from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish Lekwungen Nation, which is better known to some of you as Victoria. I'm going to introduce the concept of municipal natural assets management and discuss its potential relevance to everything that you're discussing here today. And what I'd like to propose is that natural assets management can be part of an overall comprehensive solution to some of the coastal and climate change and related issues that this group is wrestling with. Could you skip ahead 2 slides, please? I just want to take a minute to kind of situate natural assets management. It's certainly not the be all and end all. And as you can see in that diagram on the right, there's a much broader category that we could think of as green infrastructure, and also a broad category of nature-based solutions. And I would say that municipal natural assets management, which is one subset of this. So if you skip ahead a slide, please. So what are municipal natural assets? So these are the stocks of natural resources or ecosystems that local governments can or do rely on for sustainable provision of one or more services. And that's quite a mouthful, so I'm going to unpack that in a second. And what I'd really like to propose, if you forget everything else I say, just, I would say, remember that nature can be one of our most important assets, one of our most vital assets, and central to any engineer or any infrastructure system. So if you skip ahead another slide, I will unpack that idea a little bit further. So natural assets such as forests or green spaces or riparian areas or coastal zones have their own unique biological functions, but they are delivering vital services on which our communities and our local governments depend. So as an example, the biological function of a wetland may be to store water or to filter water, but that can translate into, for example, drinking water filtration or aquifer recharge. These are services for which a local government is typically on the hook to deliver and would otherwise have to provide via an engineered asset. However, in Canada, most local governments, to the extent that they're thinking about natural assets at all, are thinking about them usually as green or social or recreational amenities, not as core infrastructure. And so there's a gap between the potential of natural assets and how they are typically being acted upon. And what that can mean is that natural assets often end up being overused and under-recognized in our decision-making. And the picture that you can see at the bottom right is both a practical and a bit of a metaphorical example. It's just a farmer's ditch, which can play a very valuable role in many communities in channeling stormwater. And in this case, it's a picture I took actually in Stratford, Ontario. It's filling up with garbage. As a bit of a counterpoint, the picture to the left is taken in Gibson's British Columbia, which was really one of the pioneers, as I'll describe, in this field of natural asset management. And they are now actively managing, restoring, rehabilitating natural assets to provide core services to the local government. In this example, it's stormwater. But one of the beautiful things about working with nature is that you can rarely do only one thing. As you increase the ecological health and biodiversity of the underlying asset, you can also, of course, help nature produce a range of other co-benefits, health, other spaces. But as I say, there is this gap, and currently, why does the gap matter? It depends a little bit on one's perspective. Could you skip to the next slide, please? Briefly, from a local government point of view, the fact is, it doesn't matter whose numbers you use, but infrastructure, much of it was put in the ground 50, 60, 70 years ago. Maintenance has been often deferred. A lot of it needs replacement, and a lot of it is in poor condition. If you skip ahead again, a slide, this will be no stranger to any of you or to any of us. Climate change is putting more pressure on the engineered infrastructure systems that are in place. And practically what this means is we can't simply build our way out of the problem of delivering cost-effective and reliable services as the climate continues to change. Next slide, please. So the good news in Canada, and what's made the work of the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative possible, and I should say that I'll talk a little bit more about us. We are an NGO, is local governments in Canada, whether they like it or whether they don't like it, are required to adopt modern structured asset management processes. And the central organizing principle of modern asset management is the idea of sustainable service delivery. And it's a subtle but all important shift. And it means that if I'm the director of finance or engineering or public works, I don't really need to worry too much whether it's a gray asset, quote unquote, or a green asset that is delivering my services, only whether or not those services are cost effective and reliable. And what we are finding is a small but strong and growing body of evidence that in many, many cases, natural assets can provide those cost-effective and reliable services. Typically, they have no capital costs. And in many of the cases that we're looking at, they can also have lower operating costs and, of course, provide a wide range of other benefits. And so the organization, our organization, we're not going to local governments and saying, look, we know you're busy, we've got something new for you to worry about. We're going to them and saying, look, you have to undertake asset management anyway. So you may as well do it in a thorough and comprehensive manner. And this means also considering the role that nature plays in delivering vital services. And so we have a group of tools, methodologies, support services, and we walk them through a standard asset management process that you can see sort of illustrated on this slide, in which we first work to inventory the natural assets. And these aren't necessarily the ones just that the local government owns, but also the ones that they rely on. And that's a very important distinction. The reality is everyone is downstream of somebody else, and you're typically relying on natural assets that somebody else either has ownership or jurisdiction over. We get into condition assessments, risk identification, then into modeling to say, what is the current capacity of these assets to provide a given range of services? And then in the yellow section, this is very exciting, we can actually get into if-then scenarios. Well, what happens if I rehabilitate this forested area or wetland? What happens if we double the riparian areas? Or what happens if a forest fire takes out a quarter of my watershed? And this gives us very operational level information that we can then use in the green section, which is implementation. And implementation, someone used the expression a few minutes ago, not one size fits all, very context specific and location dependent here also, but I can share some examples. So that's the kind of work we are doing. We are also providing an understanding of the value of the services that nature provides. And I want to be very clear that we're not saying that nature is worth a certain amount, because I don't think we can actually do that. I mean, if a First Nation has been identified with the landscape for 8,000 years, who is anyone else to say that it's, that land is quote unquote worth a certain amount? We speak, M&AI speaks to the value of services from natural assets. And all of this information helps local governments and their partners make better, more evidence-based decisions. Because here's the thing, if you don't understand what nature is doing, what services it is providing, and you go ahead with your decision-making anyway, you're still factoring nature in, you're still giving it a value. That value just happens to be zero. And we all know what happens when something is valued at zero. Next slide, please. I don't have a ton of time to go into examples, but I'll just say that all of this work started in Gibsons, BC. By the end of this year, we'll have worked in roughly 90 communities across Canada. To give you just a very brief couple of small examples of this, what this has meant at a practical level, Grand Forks in British Columbia, in 2017 and 2018, they had really devastating floods and back-to-back states of emergency. So they decided to look into the role and value of the Kettle River floodplain And we explored different development scenarios. So what would happen if it's built out? What would happen if it's restored? And to make a very long story short, all of this analysis, I don't want to make it sound like it was all our work, other people have been involved in this also, but the result of all of this analysis is that they realized, look, our floodplain is our best defense against future flooding incidents. So they secured around 51 million from the Federal Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, and they're currently restoring the floodplain to its original state. As another example, Riverview in New Brunswick, this was a development scenario, and there's a large development proposed in a fairly small watershed of roughly 50 square kilometers, and they wanted to identify key areas that were important, and they had actually planned for a road to cut right through a wetland. What we were able to determine through all the modeling and the scenario analysis is that the wetlands provided a stormwater service value of around $1.5 million a year under current, sorry, that $1.5 million if you had to provide the services by another means, under our current climate, rising to around double that in future climate scenarios. Again, cutting to the chase, the local government has now moved the road altogether and is protecting some of those wetlands because they've sort of got an evidence base for including it in their decision making. Next slide, please. I've done that. I've done the case examples. So one more slide here. What I just want to say very briefly, our mission as a not-for-profit is to make this a broadly based example across Canada. That's obviously not going to happen because we're running around to each one of 4,000 local governments. We also work at a normative or enabling level. And to give some practical examples, we've been working with the engineering regulator in BC. They released about 6 weeks ago new professional practice guidelines. These have the force of law, and they say that if you're an engineer in BC and you want to keep your license and you're doing asset management, well, you've got to think about nature also. Our hope is to continue that with other engineering regulators in other provinces. As another example, there's quite a lot of issues with the accounting standards as they relate to natural assets. Yesterday, I'm very happy to say there was an extremely interesting and productive discussion at the Public Sector Accounting Board discussion group, all of which to say there's lots going on. The one other thing that I guess I should say is a lot of my examples so far have focused on stormwater, surface water, quality and quantity. We have done some initial coastal zone work. It's in early phases. It's focused on marine coastlines. I do think that there's a lot that can be transferred to the Great Lakes. Our work, which you can find on our website, it considered the role of coastal natural assets such as eelgrass, seagrasses, beach, dunes, shoreline vegetation in mitigating the impacts of storm surge and coastal erosion. We've developed out of that a bit of a rapid screening tool so that before anyone spends $250,000 or $500,000 on complicated engineering studies, you can at least get an early indication of the potential role of natural assets. We did find in this work that natural assets can play a very important role in mitigating coastal erosion and coastal flooding. Probably no big surprise following on the presentations that we have just heard. But our sample size was very small. It was one BC community and one in New Brunswick. So we will be looking at expanding that. Great Lakes is a perfectly good candidate. And we've also got another project rolling called the Source to Sea project, which is to really understand the connections between everything that is going on on the land and in coastal zone projects. So that's a very quick walk through our work. There's many communities in the region. I know some of them are on the line. And we'd be very pleased to follow up with anyone who is interested in learning more.
Thank you very much, Roy, and thank you, Alex and Brian as well. We'll now move into the question period. So if I could start with some earlier questions on winds and weights, and this is for Brian or David to answer. Was there a significant increase in wind events on Lake Huron during 2020 and 2021? David, can you answer that one?
I think what we're seeing is Aisha had presented in our first webinar some information on wind speeds, which seem to be kind of decreasing, but we're getting these higher peak events where we have peak winds that are coming kind of hurricane force, literally hurricane force winds that show up over the bay, which aren't related to, you know, a big hurricane forming out over the oceans. And so it's when we're planning and looking at risk mitigation, it's not just the average wind speed that we have to be planning for. We have to be thinking about and planning for these potential peak events. And we see some significant winds and tornadoes forming and things like that with different frequencies than we've historically been used to.
Okay, that actually answers some of the other questions on this. There's another one. In calculating fetch, if there is a large island 5 kilometers in front of your island, does this shorten the fetch? I guess that's Alex or Brian to answer.
Yes, it does. And, you know, in those cases, an island is essentially acting as a natural breakwater. So when you're understanding wave energy on your shoreline, understanding those very localized features such as islands are very important because they will reduce that fetch, which will in turn typically reduce the wave energy interacting with your shoreline.
Okay, this one is for Brian. I think I live in an area where the shoreline is all rock. What is the impact of waves on rock?
So if you live in an area where the shoreline is rock, you're one of the fortunate ones. You know, historically, you know, if you think in terms of thousands and thousands of years, that rock has stood the test of time at this point. So even though the waves may move the rock around a little bit or cause some rounding and smoothing of it over time, for the most part, that rock acts as a natural buffer, and it typically, due to that process of evolution over time, you know, the rock is typically winds up, you know, eroding back to a natural slope, which therefore has less of a negative impact on the lake itself, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, then we had a few questions about boat wakes and boat waves and lack of respect from boaters in some instances and going through narrow passages. So what I would say on this is that boat wakes are a major concern throughout much of Georgian Bay, and the best way we believe to address this is through education and providing information, as GBA and Boating Ontario have done to working together to develop a document called Georgian Bay for Everyone, and we'll provide a link to that. But it is also important that residents voice their concerns to their municipal council, who can put pressure on Transport Canada and OPP for increased local enforcement of boat speeds. We then had a problem. We had another question. Our challenge is the dynamic water levels. How do you apply this to our Georgian situation where water levels fluctuate in a normal 3-foot range? The first thing I would say on that is not the normal fluctuation range. It's more like 6.5 feet. But David, I thought maybe you could answer that question.
I think that when we look into projecting kind of future water levels, we're seeing that we're going to go outside of those boundaries. And so we're actually going to be having to grapple with some new potential conditions. And often looking back at historic conditions isn't really going to be that useful in informing us to mitigate risk into the future. So we've got some more work to do, and we are hoping for some studies to come out of Environment Canada early next year that will help us actually, start to address some of these issues from a science-based perspective. So right now we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern as we wait for that answer to come in.
We then had a few questions about, thank you, David, about flooding, basement flooding, cottages made of stone that can't be raised or moved. Clearly, we had quite a lot of information on that in the presentations, but I'm wondering if Brian or Alex has anything you want to add on specific flooding of properties.
So that's obviously an incredibly challenging question. One of the strategies that we saw some people apply over the last couple of years in very localized situations is actually, and I hate to say this, and I'm not going to say that I agree with it, but it's a strategy that has worked, is the installation of essentially wells and pumping to lower localized groundwater in order to minimize or reduce flooding of basements when the water level comes up that high. You can essentially install injection wells and pumps in order to reduce that very localized groundwater table. It's a very expensive and it's not necessarily a terribly sustainable solution. And you also have a source to be able to pump that water where it's not impacting someone else's property or an adjacent natural area. So there are challenges with it, but the flooding is certainly an issue that's very challenging. And when you talk about a volume of water like you are with Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, your solutions are to a degree limited outside of some things like that.
Thank you.
Could I add something to that?
Sure, yes, please do.
So you can think about that challenge at different scales, and you can of course think about it at the scale of the local homeowner, but you can also think about the challenge at a sub-watershed or watershed level. That water that's flooding a basement, it's coming from somewhere, and there may be, depending on the local context, a range of options to reduce, for example, the amount of impervious surfaces, increase the amount of pervious or permeable surfaces, and slow the flow of water through a wide range of green infrastructure solutions. So that's not primarily what we do, but bioretention facilities and the like, or upgrading or restoring or rehabilitating existing natural assets. And one interesting thing that I didn't have a chance to mention during my presentation, I understand there's some combined sewer overflow issue in your region. And I just wanted to point out in this context the work that the City of Vancouver is doing through their Rain City strategy. They have combined sewers, they have combined sewer overflow problems. The cost of simply building bigger pipes is absolutely prohibitive. The pipes are so big you can literally and figuratively drive trucks through them. It's billions and billions of dollars to replace this. But there's two ways to look at the problem. You can say, look, if there's too much water coming into the system, that more water coming into the system than we can handle, you can either build bigger pipes, or you can say, how do we get less water into the system in the first place? And it's that latter strategy that Vancouver is working on, and it's across the city, and it's a wide range of natural asset, engineered natural assets, so bioswale, or sorry, enhanced natural assets, which we would think of as bioswales and things of that sort, through to engineered natural assets like green roofs and permeable pavers, all of which help nature do what it was intended to do and keep water out of the system. So that's kind of a macro example, but it speaks to the more localized homeowner challenge. And I think you'll find also in Ontario a lot of resources on GEO, Green Infrastructure Ontario's site.
Okay, thanks very much. We're now going to move on to some additional content from David and myself. So David, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So we're kind of talking at the community scale right now and kind of at the larger scale. But if we start to bring that down to an individual property owner, and you could advance this slide here, please. We actually start, having to think about what's going on our own property or in our own space. Rupert, did you want to speak to this slide?
Yes, certainly. These are issues that the IJC identified at our last session, and really the first four are the ones that we'll be talking about today, and have already talked about erosion setbacks, relocation of dwellings, flood elevation and protection requirements, and shoreline alteration requirements. Next slide. And so the first question we're going to deal with is, should the municipal high water level mark be changed? And if you can just go to the next slide. We believe that these high water level marks should be under review because the water level in 2019-20 exceeded them. And you'll see this from this slide that's coming up, where most of the, in fact, all of the coastal municipalities have high water marks that were well under that level. I won't go through this slide, but it's there for information purposes later. So if you go to the next slide. So here are some examples of 100-year flood levels around the bay, and you can see this graphically illustrates the point I just made, that the high water marks that are being used by the municipalities are below these levels. Just keep clicking. There we go. And then, yeah, there we go. All right, and so on to the next slide.
So when we do think about this from a community perspective, our municipal governments and planners have to think about kind of the broader scale, right? So what areas of the community are at risk? What's the nature and magnitude? What's the value of the properties and buildings that are at risk? And what's the overall community vulnerability? In addition, in many ways, we also have to think about what level of risk the community is prepared to accept. Next slide. So there's been some research that's been looked at because we're starting to examine coastal marine zones and sea level rise and flooding on the sea coasts, the ocean coasts. The researchers, specifically Doberstein et al., actually in 2019 realized that the ways of approaching those problems could be applied all across Canada and in the Great Lakes. So as landowners, we have to start thinking about protecting, accommodating, retreating, and avoiding. This is called PARA, P-A-R-A, where protecting would be basically a reactive strategy to put in place some type of hard infrastructure like a breakwater or a dike or something like that, or retaining walls to protect existing structures or infrastructure. Accommodate would be to continue to occupy hazardous areas, but do what we talked about earlier, right? Start looking at how to naturalize the shore, how to dissipate wave energies, how to accommodate flooding, how to bring back wetlands if they've been removed in order to absorb and allow us to accommodate the increasing wave energies, for example, that we're seeing. Retreating literally means taking the infrastructure or buildings and moving them away from the coastline or away from the hazardous zones. And avoiding means kind of a long-term planning and decision-making process whereby we would come up with bylaws, just like Ontario did back in the 1950s when Hurricane Hazel hit. They came out with floodplain protection and regulations around prohibiting development on a floodplain. And there have been huge economic benefits to Ontario for that, as opposed to some other jurisdictions on the US side, because we didn't allow that development, and therefore we haven't incurred the billions of dollars in damages that have occurred in other jurisdictions. Next slide. There's kind of this threefold bottom line approach where we want to look at minimizing loss of land and physical capital, reducing coastal flood risks to acceptable levels within a human settlement, and then planned and efficient retreat from areas that cannot be protected. And of course, that all comes together as an adaptation strategy for our communities. And even for our individual properties, there may be buildings on the property that need to be abandoned or moved. But all of this has to come together in your thinking process as to how you approach this. And in order to do that, I mentioned the study from Environment Canada that we're waiting for, and which we dealt with in our first webinar, to really get an understanding of what these future potential risks that are going to present themselves are and how we want to respond over the next couple of decades. Next slide. These are just some of the tools, and as Rupert said, you will have access to the materials later on, so for your own reference. But when you get down to the fourth and fifth lines here, this is where, starting to decide what kind of structural tools, naturalization you could use as far as non-structural, tools on your shorelines, or raising your buildings up, or things like that, are the thought processes that everybody are going to have to start to undertake now. Next slide. Bottom line, and this was a quote from Wendy Leger, who heads up the GLAM committee, the Great Lakes Adaptive Management Committee. Basically, the Great Lakes, we need to prepare for more extremes, whether it's extreme weather patterns or extreme water levels or droughts and storms, winds. It's this idea that we need to start preparing for more extremes. Next slide, and over to you, Rupert.
Yes, okay, so let's go back to a few other questions. We had a number of questions about erosion with steel walls and beach issues. And what are the best methods of slowing erosion or dealing with it? Brian or Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to what you've already said in the presentation on these types of issues, in terms of other techniques that maybe you weren't in your presentation?
Sure. I'll let Alex go first. If you wanted to touch on anything, Alex, and then I can chime in afterward.
Yeah, I can talk for a second. If we can pull up my slide deck again, is that possible? We'll go to the slides at the end of the presentation. So, there's kind of a bioengineering continuum here that we have to follow based on shoreline energy and shoreline conditions and all those other little aspects that we look at when we look at managing shorelines. So when this slide gets pulled up, it'll be a little more clear. But the first thing we look at is really non-invasive, and maybe that's just replanting shorelines. There's that bioengineering continuum. Maybe that's just replanting shorelines and providing a soft buffer in areas that don't need a whole lot of help. And that goes all the way up to stuff that maybe couldn't be considered bioengineering. Maybe that's more traditional engineering. But on this, you'll see that you can see these revetments and bulkheads, and these are used in places where there's typically existing hardened shoreline structures, and there's erosion taking place already, and we need to mitigate that erosion. When you look at bulkheads, it's like a seawall. You're going to have those same erosive effects in the front and around the sides of the wall, but there are some techniques you can use to, I guess, kind of harden that bulkhead and that seawall in front of it. And kind of what we were talking about earlier is maybe gentling out that slope a little bit. So if we can go back a slide, maybe.
I think we can only go forward, actually.
Oh, go forward. Yeah, go forward a slide. Excuse me. Another slide. One more slide. So here's kind of this hybrid seawall living shoreline design. This comes from the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program in Florida, using specifications from the Florida Department of Transportation. And what you can see here is this existing seawall and existing ground in a mean high water level. And you can see in front of the seawall, they've used some like revetment, and then in the middle of that, kind of that bio-D block or some soft material in there that can be planted. So you get a rock, kind of a rock revetment, some plantings, some natural materials in there, willows, sedges and stuff to break down that wave energy, a little bit more rock revetment before it hits that seawall. If we can go forward a slide, please. Here's an example of kind of this technique in a higher energy environment. It's missing the rocks down below, but it looks like this has a pretty good beach that's not eroding right now. So you see some beach, you see some grass to break down that energy, and you see some rocks to really break it down further before it hits the seawall. One more slide, please. And here's kind of the low energy example of that where there's not much wave action.
Thanks very much. I think I'd like to just move on to one other question. Brian, can Brian talk about ice formation and melt as an erosion factor?
Sure. Ice, especially for those in the upper Great Lakes, is an incredible challenge. So I like to think of ice as both a protective force and a destructive force. Typically, when we get good ice cover in the winter, it actually reduces erosion on shorelines because our shorelines are protected from those winter storms that typically occur when vegetation isn't growing and does not buffer the wave energy. At the same time, that ice can be an incredibly destructive force, be it the large formation of shelf ice, or typically in the spring, when that ice breaks up, it can cause significant ice gouge and actually can displace structures, homes, things like that. So the challenge in dealing with ice from a natural solution and engineering perspective is understanding just how that ice interacts with the shoreline itself. The reality is, if we get large shelf ice formations, there aren't a lot of natural solutions that can buffer that. But what we see from nature is that when we have those nice, gentle, sloped shorelines, those are the shorelines where when the ice breaks up, it gently rides up and it gently rides down. The shoreline might move around a little bit, but because the processes are intact, those processes of ice breakup are still natural, and the shoreline may move, but it might be okay as long as we move structures back to some degree. If we're dealing, sorry, go ahead, Rupert.
Sorry, no, okay, fine. I think we've only got time for one more question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but just the final question before we move on is, are there ways to protect rocky shorelines versus sandy ones? And I'm thinking that either Brian or Alex could quickly address that, and then we have to move on to the next section. Thanks.
So I would, I guess I would say that yes, there are. It depends on if it's natural rock or if it's placed rock, like rock riprap. There are ways to add vegetation to unnatural rock in order to regain those ecological benefits. And that comes, I had a picture in my presentation of a natural shoreline that was cobble, but also had willows growing through it. So when you're able to do that, you're mimicking natural shorelines, gaining ecological benefit, while at the same time working with that rock. So you can actually introduce vegetation into the rock itself sometimes.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to wrap these questions up. There will be an opportunity at the end for more questions. So the next section we're going to be dealing with, the topic B on coastal infrastructure, is what are the impacts on shoreline businesses, including marinas, contractors, and other services at extreme high water levels, shoreline businesses and docks and other shoreline structures, the impacts and adaptation strategies, and what the regulations are. From GBA's perspective, since the last webinar, GBA has made a few strides. We've hired a coordinator for our coastal protections projects, which has allowed us to move forward on several projects, including those on planning that are relevant to this webinar. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative has invited me to join their Coastal Resiliency Committee meetings as an observer, and we continue to work with many other groups on various issues to do with the topics that we're talking about, so And we believe that this webinar is an important part of the learning process, both for GBA and our members, to improve our understanding of the options for our docks and shoreline structures to deal with stronger winds, larger waves, and increasing water levels variability, while keeping our shorelines as natural as possible. This will not be an easy challenge. These are not easy challenges. So here today to kick off this second section of our webinar is Rick Layzell, who is the CEO of the Boating Ontario Association since 2017. We've worked with Rick on a number of fronts, so we are really pleased that he could make time for us today. Thank you, Rick, and please take it away.
Thanks very much, Rupert and David, and good morning to all. I thought I'd share just a little bit of a scope, and I do have a timer on here, folks. I know we're running a little bit of behind schedule, but I thought I'd share a bit of a scope of the marinas that we work with that are on the bay from the Tobermory over to up to the Sioux region. So we represent about just over 60 marinas, and I'm in sales and business development. I'll call it 10,000 slips, and more importantly, 10,000 families. Whether it's families that need to access their water access or island cottage properties, or families for whom their boat is their cottage. These marinas represent an average of about 163 slips per 163 slips or 163 families per marina, and keep that number in mind as we go through the core of the conversation this morning. Next slide, please. So I reached out because I am certainly not a dock or manufacturing or infrastructure investment expert, but we do have a couple of members that are. So I reached out to a firm out of Parry Sound, Ontario that I would call a Canadian success story. I actually dealt with Jordan's dad many years ago when Croft Industries' core business was building hydraulic trailers for marinas. They have really expanded their business into dock systems, marine cradles, hydraulic trailers, wave attenuators. They do business all over North America. And if I can ask, we go to the next slide. There's a video that you can just click on the bottom left of that, if you wouldn't mind, please. It's just 30 seconds. Hopefully the sound works. If the sound works, it doesn't work. It's pretty self-explanatory, folks. You see a bit of the scope of the work that Croft does. And it really is quite compelling, the number of marinas all over the province of Ontario that use their products and their services to support the work that we do on your behalf. So we can go to the next slide if we could, please. There we go. So when I spoke with Jordan a couple of weeks ago, our dialogue was intentionally around today's topic and really trying to get some scope of the impact financially to a marina because of fluctuating water levels, whether it's high or low. We obviously have to move from crib systems, as many of you do with your own properties, into float systems. And Jordan was very quick to say, Rick, it's an $8,000 to $10,000 conversation just to start the discussion per slip. Now that includes hydro and water. So if we say, well, we're more of a water access or island access marina, we don't need hydro or water. Well, we can take out $2,000 and call it 8. But then you're going to add another $2,000 per slip to remove the existing materials and cribs that are there. None of that factors in on-land utilities, which can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I am acutely aware of a marina that had to move a transformer in the 2019 flooding, or his entire facility would have been without power. Hydro One took a step back and allowed him to write the check for a significant amount of money. And again, the dock systems does not incorporate the cost of gangways or security systems. So those walkways and ramps that get you from the shore onto the dock systems themselves. Floating dock systems also bring into play a significant increased maintenance cost. Obviously, a fixed dock is there, it sits there for the summer season, and it's done. When you're dealing with floating docks, you are constantly sending your staff down to adjust floats, add or extend chains, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Remember the 163 slip number. Just the dock system is a $1.5 million discussion at a marina. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we know that on many Georgian Bay facilities, the beauty of Georgian Bay rocks is the preferred shore wall system. We get it. But there's also many Georgian Bay marinas that utilize shore wall systems. Another $2,000 per running foot. 300 feet is the number I used. I didn't get out a measuring tape to get this number. I looked at a number of our member partners and said, okay, that's going to be about an average. There will be some that are less, there will be some that are more, but this is another $600,000 conversation for the marina from an investment perspective. And again, that does not include removal of the existing infrastructure. And that does not include boardwalks or any of those systems that we provide along the shoreline for our guests to safely walk as you move towards your boat. So if you're counting, folks, we're over $2 million already. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Shoreline property, and I know this is near and dear to many of you from your cottage property and your investment property perspective. It's also near and dear to us. It is our showrooms. It is our parts stores. It is our fuel and lubricant buildings. It's our roadways. It's the parking facilities that we offer to you as our guests. And in many cases, it's our homes. Our homes are on the waterfront, and this affects the homes that we live in, and potentially we're looking at displacing some of our families. And, you know, in marinas in the province of Ontario, these buildings didn't happen over a couple of short years. These buildings and the investments that were made in these buildings that the small businesses, which is what marinas are, these buildings were made on years of sound investment and understanding of what the water levels were doing, and they were at the time safe. So to pick up a home and just move it is no easier than just to pick up a marina and just move it. Next slide, please. We're doing great on time here. I'm at 6 minutes, Rupert, I'm counting. So
You're doing brilliantly.
permits, inspections, regulations. Boy, this one just goes on and on and on. I put up a couple of examples and a picture of a transformer. This slide could take days, and I wouldn't do that to you. It is a long list to start moving, and the moment you discuss electrical around the water, the conversation gets longer. Now you want to talk about fuel so we can put gas in your boat. That's another discussion that brings in the TSSA, the Technical Safety and Standards Association. So there's a long list of processes and inspections and permits and dollars and cents that go out to make this happen. All of that on top of that 2 million that we talked about earlier. So next slide, please. How they manage. How does a marina look at this? Because I can assure you, they're not all sitting on millions of dollars in cash waiting to go and buy new dock systems and shore wall systems. So we typically take a bite at a time. Year one, and this is a very broad-based 1,000-foot up example, you might say, excuse me, I'm sorry, we might say we've got the ability, excuse me, sorry, to make replace our main finger docks. And then maybe in year two, we go to the secondary docks, the security systems, the gangways, the launch ramp. And year three, perhaps, then we're going to be able to look at the shore wall. I can also tell you that there are many, many marinas around the province that we work with, that there is a gap between year one and year two and a gap between year two and year three, because they can't just roll out $1.5 million in year one and another $500,000 or more in year two. That money is not in these businesses. And while those investments happen, folks, other investments get parked. And that is the roadways that you drive on in our facilities. Look, we're not proud when you pull into a marina and your car's doing this after coming up and down the highway to get into the marina because the potholes haven't been repaired or the roads aren't in the condition that we want them to be in. There are times when dock systems for your boats become a higher level of importance from our members than their own building repairs. So building repairs, whether it's rooftops or whatever, get put on the back burner while we make sure that the docks are in the right condition they're in. Our storage facilities will often also be put on hold. So this is intentionally, again, a very broad-based list. But you can imagine, again, I'll reference the 2 million, keeping in mind we didn't talk about any of the other pieces of this giant puzzle at 160 slip marina. Now put that into perspective, the number of marinas that have 300 and 400 and 500. There's a couple of marinas on Georgian Bay with well over 600 slips. So the numbers just go out from that. They don't shrink. It doesn't become you're going to pay a whole lot less because you got 300 or 400 slips. It's still, you're talking in that $8,000 to $10,000 just to get the slips done. So Last slide, please, if you will. Look at that, 9 minutes. I put my contact information there for you. I also put the expert's contact, and I did reach out to Jordan. I said, if you don't mind, I'm going to put yours up. He said, absolutely, Rick, go ahead. I am not a dock manufacturing expert. I know Rupert reached out last night with some questions, and I said, in all full respect, folks, this is not my area of expertise, and I don't want to sit and guess, nor do I want to tell you I don't have answers for you. So thank you again for the time, and I hope that snippet of information was valuable in helping you understand the scope from a marina perspective. Oh, Rupert, over to you.
Rick, that was great. I think it's very important, particularly for our GBA members, to recognize just how challenging these fluctuating water levels are for our marinas that we rely on so completely, particularly for the water access only community. So David, take it away for the next section.
Next slide, please. So we have been talking about, the need in Georgian Bay to respect our natural spaces and to look at how we can increase our shoreline resilience while still respecting those natural processes, enhancing terrestrial and marine habitats, and providing recreational opportunities. And I think if we were to look at some of the, hardened shoreline slides that we've seen that may be necessary to protect property, certainly naturalization may not be the solution everywhere. But if you look at it from the perspective of a turtle trying to get to shore, you kind of start to have to look at this in a completely different light. Next slide, please. So as our water levels rise and fall, and you can see the cottage in the kind of back portion, back left of each picture here is the same. We know that we are, as Rupert mentioned earlier, living in a space that naturally has had about 6.5 feet of water level fluctuation. The plant communities are able to withstand these kinds of impacts and changes. But at any given time, one particular spot on the bay may look completely different. The next slide. So our bay really is a dynamic place, but we're starting to see changes that are beyond these historic ranges. There's increased variability in water levels, the move towards these more rapid transitions between extreme levels, and the extreme levels being beyond the historical extremes, escalating violence of the storm energies that we're seeing. Again, these kind of points in time where we're subjected to enormous deluges and wind speeds. But these are going to continue to present increasing challenges to managing our shoreline structures. So as we start to think about the next couple of decades, and individuals on their properties will have unique problems or unique challenges, because every property is different and faces a different direction and has different fetch and so on, as we've seen. But as you're starting to think into the future about new construction or relocations, then you're going to have to really consider placing them well above the minimum setbacks from the high water marks required by the municipalities. And until those are really, re-examined and set, that is a difficult thing for a property owner to do or understand, right? So we need to have this information from Environment Canada as soon as possible to consider this properly. Next slide. Obviously, fixed infrastructure, as Rick just said, docks or boathouses that are built on cribs are probably not going to be dynamic or resilient enough to survive those. You can see the boathouse is submerged here back in 2020 when the water levels were high, but the cottage is still high and dry. So really siting on a property becomes important. And it is that land-water interface and the structures that are on that interface that are going to be the most susceptible, and we really are going to have to think about a lot. Next slide, please. This also impacts our municipal infrastructure. This is the Perry Sound Municipal Pier. And back in the April of 2020, the water levels were at extreme high levels, but we also had a west wind set up for quite a while, strong westerly wind. And it just piled extra water into this area and completely flooded the municipal pier. So it is, of course, critical infrastructure for the businesses that are there and also for the public to access the bay, and became unusable at those times. And also, as Rick mentioned, Any transformers that had been installed in that area that were threatening to be now underwater created an electrocution problem for anybody even touching the water in that area. Next slide, please. And I wanted to just kind of leave one impression here. This was, just press the advance once, Heather, just to bring the number up. This was a storm, one storm that hit back in October of 2020 at Sunset Point in Collingwood. The damage to the municipal infrastructure, this was part of kind of the coastal path there, is very significant. $300,000 to fix the damage that occurred there. And of course, you know, having the means to fix something is not really the solution, because if it was your cottage that was being damaged, you would lose the use of your cottage while you were trying to fix it, right? But it's basically an unsustainable type of situation. If we don't anticipate the potential for these energies and design accordingly, we'll be running around continuously spending money fixing damage that's occurred. So really some important thoughts to think about, and these costs can be enormous. Next slide. And over to Rupert.
Yes, so the provincial policy statement is really sets the scene for municipal planning regulations. And this section relates to the need for setbacks from the high water mark and avoiding developments in flood zones. It also allows for adjustments as climate change impacts unfold. So next slide. So what are the regulations? So planning permission requirements for new replacement docks and relocating shoreline structures vary by municipality. But next slide, we have put together a table which basically shows what you need to do in most municipalities for various situations in terms of crib docks, floating docks, and shoreline structures. They all have different regimes and different requirements. I'm not going to go through this, but it'll be there for information purposes later. So you can see there are different things you need to do, and you need to consult your local municipality to find out what you need to do in individual situations. So next slide. And as David was saying earlier, we would recommend that you consider placing any new buildings or relocations well above the minimum setback requirements of current high water mark, because as we were looking at earlier, the high water level mark has gone above the high water marks for all the coastal municipalities in 2019-20, and we know it's going to get worse. So next slide. So I guess this all comes down to there's a need to plan. If you have an issue on your shoreline that you need to address, you know, vulnerable buildings that could be flooded, etc. Think of some of these things. Raising buildings that do not have plumbing and extensive decks is usually quite straightforward. You do have to get the permits that we referred to in the previous slide. And also this applies to relocation, which is more expensive, but that may not always be possible, and may not even be higher ground available for them. You should think about some boathouses can be converted to floating structures, and consider if you're building a new boathouse to make it floating rather than on a fixed pier. And also contractors have solutions for most of these problems. So you should consult your contractor if you have something that you need to address. Next slide.
So of course, as Rupert just said, there are good reasons why floating structures should be considered. And our contracting community will be coming up with innovations and creative solutions. Next slide. But there are some current kind of ideas that maybe could get you started with here. And Heather, if you could just advance twice for the little zoom ins here. This is an example of a dock that has actually got these dampening arms fixed to it, which can help absorb the wave action. So you can see the ramp down to the dock, but the dock isn't just dependent on the ramp for strength to hold itself in position. It's got these adjustable and spring loaded arms that are attached to it so that the wave energy can be absorbed a little more easily, but also as water levels change, those arms can simply pivot up and down with the ramp and provide the same strength at different water levels. So because the dock is kind of out in the deeper water here, it can accommodate fluctuations in the water level regime changes that we expect to experience. Next slide. It's also possible for us to look in other areas that already are dealing with these kinds of issues. And just as an example of being able to look elsewhere, this is Sydney, Nova Scotia, up on Cape Breton Island. And one more advance to get the zoom in. You can see similarly kind of an articulated arm from an anchor point that goes out to the dock. And as the tide rises and falls, the dock is still held very securely at whatever the water is, whatever the water level is. So designing into Georgian Bay structures that may exist elsewhere in water level regimes that are fluctuating already or have fluctuated really is just a matter of getting creative and applying techniques that exist elsewhere into our space where we may not have thought of applying those before. Next slide, please. As Rupert said, following the appropriate regulations and building code requirements is important, but raising structures is possible. It doesn't change the fact that the land underneath the building may still flood, but it's possible to mitigate the impacts on the actual asset itself, the structure itself. Or it may be an opportunity to not only lift the building, but also consider moving it on the property. Again, all of this requires a better understanding of what the expected risks are. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of getting this climate modeling information out of Environment Canada as quickly as possible so that municipalities and individual property owners can assess these risks. Next slide. And talking about bringing in innovation, this is just an example of a structure that was engineered for the Thames River in the United Kingdom, where the banks of the Thames are often flooded. Here, there's actually a structure that's built on a floating concrete honeycomb. And as the water floods the property, it simply raises the building up safely and in a secured way so that the building itself is not affected and the contents of the building are not affected. So there will be solutions that we can bring depending on the site and the location. Some will be more appropriate than others, but it's the idea of getting ourselves prepared for these changes, understanding what the risks are that we want to mitigate for, and then starting to really design that into our plans over the next 10, 20, 30 years so that we're not hit all of a sudden with enormous costs because of bad decisions that we've made over those 30 years. Next slide.
So I think we're into questions now. So
yeah, just a final quote. If your property is already getting wet, it most certainly will be getting wetter in the future. And while we know that there is some uncertainty about exactly what climate change will do, the basic message that we're hearing over and over again from the experts is that these extreme highs and lows are going to get worse and that volatility is the new normal. So complacency isn't the answer. We are definitely going to have to incorporate and think about these coming changes. Rupert, over to you.
Okay. So we had a few questions on the high water level mark, so we might just cover those. Where are we here? Okay, so what modeling is available online? Permissions are being accommodated for these water level fluctuations. Is the municipal high water mark ever subject to review, and who is responsible for setting it? How should municipalities and landowners handle decisions making use of the current high water level mark, given that it's likely to change? So online modeling information on upcoming water levels was provided at the previous webinar. Municipalities have the option to fast track planning and building permits if they declare a state of emergency. It was done by some of them in 2013 when there was an extreme low water level affecting access to some properties. Okay, I keep getting kicked out of this, sorry. Okay. as recommended in the presentation, we suggest that new building or relocations should be placed well above the setback from the high water mark to cater for increasing water levels. Another raft of questions concerned municipal planning regulations. How can the municipalities be involved to protect the township seem not to be informed of these issues with bylaws like height restrictions? How are they changing? And what are the municipalities doing to adapt to this situation? So, and then there was another question about shoreline clutter. Anyway, communities need to work with their municipality to ensure that planning regulations are being respected and followed. Public consultations on planning bylaw reviews are an opportunity for communities to provide input. In GBA's experience, municipalities are well informed on climate change issues from various sources, including the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, AMO, where Parry Sound Mayor Jamie McCarville is now the president, and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, who provide a wealth of information on climate change adaptation and other matters. And we're one of the organizations that put together Action Plan 2030 that we heard about in the previous webinar. Another question was, how might building codes on private waterfront property be effective? If current boathouse location is not viable anymore, are they allowed to move to a new location or rebuild? So building codes are a province and do not change often. In the presentation, information was provided on what is required for relocation and rebuilds. Okay, we had also some questions on docks and shoreline structures. How can I modify a crib dock to withstand water level fluctuations? What is the best way to build or preserve cribbing, dock and boathouse structures and connection to floating structure? Is there anything we can modify on existing dock cribs and build a new crib to survive this fluctuation in water levels? Well, you know what, the reality is that it is going to get increasingly challenging to preserve, modify and maintain crib docks to provide useful docking and shoreline access. When water levels are low, the exposed support beams for crib docks can rot. As the range of water levels increases with more rapid transitions between extremes, highs and lows as projected, crib docks will require continual and expensive maintenance. Changing to floating docks and ramps instead of fixed shoreline structures will avoid these issues. So we have time for a few more questions. So I think we should go back to some of the earlier ones on shoreline and naturalization. And Roy, there were a few questions here about how can we clean up waterfront without going into water with heavy equipment, public use of shoreline, impact on inshore wells, etc. Best way to build or preserve land and floating structures, and how do altered peninsulas affect the neighboring shorelines? Would you be able to have a go at those questions, Roy?
Rupert, Roy dropped off earlier.
Oh.
He was unfortunately able to go, but he could provide an answer to that question. And
we'll follow up on those later. I do apologize, I didn't realize that. Alex, are you still there? Is Alex still there? Okay. Right. Alex, I didn't get an answer.
Oh, I'm here. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay, sorry. So there's some other questions here. Can shorelines be trimmed or managed to maintain shoreline stability and simultaneously improve water views from land? What are the protection? How do you protect structures near the waterline? We are looking to learn more about shoreline protection. The question. As more cottage owners are becoming grandparents, I've noticed more and more wetlands being smothered by barging in sand to create artificial beaches. Any thoughts on that? Could you, these are sort of generally speaking the same sort of question. Would you be able to have a go at answering those?
Yeah, just, you know, it's hard to say this, but there's no simple answer to this. Every site's going to have its own specific limitations and opportunities. As far as restoring beaches, that's a really tough one. Once you've lost a beach, it's pretty tough to get it back. And I know that's something that's come up a lot in these conversations, but really, once a beach is lost and once all that material and sand is gone, one of your few options is retreat, moving structures, infrastructure away from the beach and rebuilding that shoreline and renaturalizing it. And that's really the short answer. The long answer is that, well, I guess that's the long answer. And the short answer is that there's no easy answer because every site's is going to be specific.
Thanks very much. One question we had during the webinar was this: as a freshwater ecologist living in the Muskoka watershed, I've seen many opportunities to look at the flow modifications that impact the water coming down to Georgian Bay. At scale, these river, wetland, and lake ecosystems have been greatly modified, and similar to wave action, these impact and erode riparian, shoreline, and inundated habitats, ecosystem functions, and services, and biodiversity. How can municipalities and watershed groups come together to address these basic ecosystem issues? Some do not even have environmental departments, let alone ecologists or ecological resources. I'm wondering if Brian or Alex can address that, or maybe David?
Sure, I'll talk briefly on that. To paraphrase what Alex just said, there's no simple answer, but it requires a shift in thinking, going from site level planning to landscape level planning. And you're looking at, instead of stabilizing an individual shoreline, you're trying to repair ecosystem processes, which means a group of communities need to really look holistically and work together and band those resources together to understand how the actions on one community's shoreline is going to affect another's. And by broadening your scope and working together, you can focus on those big picture processes of sediment transport and nutrient cycling that are really make these shoreline systems inherently stable historically. But the trick is it starts with people working together at a much larger scale than their individual municipality.
Okay, I think that's pretty much it for questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for a range of excellent questions and from the floor and on registration. So please remember to sign up for the next webinar on December 4th if you have not already done so. Details are on the screen, and there is a direct link in the chat to go straight to the registration page. At this point, I would like to thank the presenters and other panel members for their excellent presentations and answers to questions, all the participants for taking the time to join us today and for putting forward so many interesting and insightful questions, all those who've done so much work behind the scenes to make this webinar such a success. And now, and particular thanks to Elder Marilyn Capriol for opening the session today and for framing our discussion so beautifully. So now here again to lead us in a closing prayer is Marilyn. Thank you.
We talked about and Jesus, that freezing moon woman that is making her way to shine on us soon. We were so happy to see her when we were children, that fresh breath that came from Chinodin, that north wind, as it breathed upon her body and made her into that crystal clear ice. When we were children, we were happy to wake up and see that one morning. We played along the shorelines and we acknowledged all the little plants that we could see through that ice woman. At that time too, it gave us the notion to harvest the reeds, that's what we called them, but they were the round green weeds that grow along the shoreline that are no longer as plentiful as they were 70 some years ago. We would harvest those at that point under my mother and grandfather's scrutiny, and they were the food for the next year's garden. We carefully laid them there and covered them with leaves, a natural source containing all the benefits of the water. We had a stationary dock because flotation was not even a question in mind at that time. My brother, he would take us out on the dock when that freezing ice came, and you could see for miles. And beneath that ice still stood the long green weeds, and we'd be able to watch them. He taught us about sound, to hear the sound of the thickness and the clearness and the health of the ice. He'd carry a big pocket full of stones, and we'd have to listen very, very carefully. He would throw those stones out only at this time of year, and you would hear the pinging as it went across, bounce from one spot to the other like a jackrabbit, traveling across that ice. And it would tell us the thick, the thinner, and the not so thin, where it became dangerous. And he told us the stories, so much about the plant life, the leaves that still flowed back and forth, the weeds. And in that process of watching them, they just swayed so gently with the far off current. And he would say to us, say your piece with those places where the fish live. Those weeds are waving to you goodbye. And sure enough, the next morning, there'd be a snow skiff on that ice woman. And so it is like this gathering today. We've learned so much, we've shared so much. And I thank you for listening from my ancestors as their blood flows through me, my spirit, my body, and my mind. In our languages, we don't have words like goodbye, only emotion, thought, and spirit. And so with us, my brothers, sisters, and family, and the new relatives that come to sit in the circle today, celebrate what is a natural given. And with that, I'm simply going to say Pamampi until we sit together the next time. Aha, miigwech, 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 miigwech. Miigwech, Rupert. David.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Beautiful words and very image evoking. So thank you for that. We greatly appreciate everybody attending this webinar. And as Rupert said, we do have a final one where we'll be talking about insurance and floodplains and things that directly impact properties and businesses again. And we welcome you to register for those webinars. Thanks to everyone, as Rupert said, all of our presenters and speakers for taking time out of your busy schedules and preparing all of these great materials. We view this as an opening of the conversation, and we will be continuing this and posting the information from this webinar on our websites, respectively, GBA and GBF. And thanks to our co-sponsors, the Severn Sound Environmental and the Council of the Great Lakes Region and the International Joint Commission.
Okay. Bye, everybody.